Hello, this is Dan Elliott. Thank you for watching my videos. I have a first design output shaft out of a transmission that I'm currently working on. I've already taken it apart, cleaned up the area that is already assembled on the output shaft, and I wanted to show you the differences between the first design output, which you may or may not have in your 6-speed, and a second design, which we've already covered in the disassembly and assembly of the Richmond Over Drive 6-speed. But this one is a first design output shaft, a little bit different from the flange area forward on how this thing is done and how the parts differ. But you'll find that third gear is basically the same. It runs on a Torrington bearing. You have your 3/4 synchronizer assembly that runs on these splines. And then we have a snap ring that sits in this groove. Then we have fourth gear that runs on a Torrington bearing with a split collar that goes in this groove, along with sixth gear that runs on the shaft. And the shaft has got little flats that are ground on it for oil, and it allows the gear to oil in between the gear itself and the shaft that it runs on because there's no bearing. Then we have our fifth gear synchronizer assembly, and a snap ring sits just in front of it. And then the front of the output shaft, the Torrington bearing runs on the shaft, the one that's up in the pocket of the input, and it runs directly on the shaft. So a little bit of differences on the front of this thing, and I know that these pieces are hard to come by. The first design, I don't know that you will find any pieces unless somebody's got some old inventory, but hopefully you don't need any of these pieces. I know when I got mine torn apart, and I'll show you the pieces here. I know when I got mine torn apart that all the pieces were pretty good. I'm going to replace the brace and the bearings, and we'll take a quick look at this, and then I will show you some little excerpts out of it as we start assembling. But I've got my input shaft, and it's got the snap ring holding the bearing. Bearing goes here on the shaft. Then we have the snap ring. I've already removed that. Got our brace ring that is for fifth gear. Our Torrington that sits up in the pocket of the input. And then it goes on the front of the output. That's where that connects together. Then we have the snap ring that sits in this groove right here, which my snap ring had a piece broken out of it, and I've got to replace. But that's one thing about these things. You never know what you're going to find till you get into them. This is the 5th, 6th synchronizer assembly, and I've got this laid out in order of how it goes back together, so you get a pretty good idea of the orientation. And like I said, be careful and mark these things to where that you know how they go back together, because it's easy to turn a hub around on the inside of these synchronizer assemblies, and it may or may not go together, but it may not work well when it gets together. But this is sixth gear and the brace for it, and like I said, there is no bearing on the inside of it. It runs directly on the shaft, and there is no bearing on the inside of sixth gear. The next thing we find is a snap ring that holds two split collars, two split sleeves together that sits in this groove right here, just ahead of fourth gear. And you've got to notice on this split collar that there is a thick side and a thin side. And I hope you can see this, that this split collar is a little bit thicker on one side. The thicker side goes to the rear, and it's got grooves in it for oiling grooves on the back side, and we'll show a little bit more of that when we get into the assembly. But this thing is a little bit thicker on the back side of the split collar, grooves on the back side, pretty much flat on the face side. Then the snap ring holds it together once you get it in place. Then we have fourth gear that sits on the main shaft, and it runs on a Torrington bearing. Then we have a snap ring holding our 3/4 synchronizer and our third gear in place once we get them on the shaft. And then we have our two Torrington bearings with the sleeve that is in between those two. So these are our pieces for our assemblies, and they are laid out in an order to where that I don't know how to put these things back together, and everything will work well when we get done. But getting ready to assemble this on the main shaft, but to get an idea, and like I say, this is a first design output shaft, and we will take a quick cleanup here, and then I can show you on the assembly how this thing goes back together, and basically that the assembly first gear, second gear from the flange back is the same as the second design, so no need to go into that again, but the difference being on the front side from the flange forward up to the input shaft. I have my output shaft assembly resting down in a tail housing that I've got, so it'll make it a little bit easier for me to do this and show you what I'm doing. But I've got the output shaft oiled, and I'm ready to assemble the pieces from the flange forward, and that's what we're looking at, is the flange forward. And I'm going to put on my third gear. This is the bearing, the Torrington, the sleeve, and the other bearing. And then I'll install my third gear onto the front of the output shaft. And keep in mind, this is a first design. Then I've got my 3/4 synchronizer assembly, which I've got it to where the orientation is correct. And then I will put it on the assembly, and as you notice here, there is nothing that goes into this groove down below the splines. It's the one above the splines, because we've got to put our synchronizer assembly on. Then we'll put the snap ring on, and then we can put our fourth gear on. All right, as you can tell, I've got my 3/4 synchronizer assembly on, and I've also got my snap ring in place, and it was the thicker of the snap rings that goes into this groove just for the splines end in front of your 3/4 synchronizer assembly. This is your third gear synchronizer assembly snap ring. Now we're getting ready to put fourth gear on, and it, remember, has a Torrington bearing that it runs on. And there's your Torrington bearing, and these are already, I've already oiled these. And this is your Bryce, and make sure the Bryce sits down into the keys and springs like it should. Then your gear sits into place, and this is the area where the split collar goes. And like I said, the thicker part of the split collar with the little slots in it go to the rear, and then the snap ring will hold this together once we get it into place. So I'll put that into place. Our split collar sits just so. Then I'm going to put the snap ring. The snap ring goes over that and holds the split collar together just in front of fourth gear, right before sixth gear goes on. So I'll put my snap ring on and get ready to put sixth gear on. All right, I've got my snap ring in place, holding my split collar together, and the snap ring is in place and seated all the way around. I'm getting ready to set the sixth gear down that runs against this split collar, and it thrusts against this. I've already oiled all of this, and that is my Bryce ring. It sits into place, and getting ready to put my 5th, 6th synchronizer assembly on top of that. Let's see if that will go into place. Most of my assembly has been relatively easy to get together because this thing has not been a press fit. it's been a slide fit, and make sure that your brace seats in the keys of the synchronizer assembly so that you've got everything into place. And then now all I have to do is make sure that my snap ring will go into the groove, and it will. And I've got to get me a new snap ring for this one, and I will round one up. I'm gonna mic it, see how thick it is, get one the same thickness or a little bit thinner, because that's just gonna add to the clearance, and then put that into place, and then I can put my input on. All right, as you notice, I have replaced the snap ring on the front. Mine was broken, had a little piece out of it, and I can show you that right here. And luckily, the little piece of the snap ring that broke off was lodged under the spring of the synchronizer assembly and kept it from getting into the gears, which saved a lot of money. But I've got my snap ring in place. I have cleaned up my input. As you notice, I have polished where the brace runs on the cone. I've polished that to where that the new brace gets a real good bite on that. And I've replaced the input bearing, and I've also put a new snap ring on the very front of this. And the snap ring is seated and in place. And I have polished the front of the input as well as where the seal runs, because sometimes the seal will have a little groove right there in the input, and you want to make sure that you polish that as best you can. Sometimes you can get all the groove out, sometimes you can't, but just do the best you can, or you may have to replace the input. At this time, it's also a good idea to clean the splines of this thing. I bead blasted these splines, just the splines. I taped everything else off. And if you do have a clutch disc, make sure that goes through the clutch disc. And also, too, it's good to put this input into a lathe or a fixture to where that you can check to make sure the input is not bent or twisted. You can, in some applications, I've seen these input shafts twisted, and sometimes you can put a straight edge down the splines and catch it if it's twisted. Sometimes you can, but usually always it'll show up when you check the straightness on the lathe or in between centers. And also, too, make sure that you clean deep inside this pocket. You can't see how deep that goes on the inside, but make sure you clean that extremely well, because it does get oil up in there, and sometimes it gets debris up in there, and you want to make sure you clean that extremely well. But right now we're finished. We are ready to finish our completed output shaft assembly and connect the input. We will put the brace on. This is for 5th gear brace. And this is the pilot bearing that goes on the front of the output shaft and tucks up into the input. And then that assembly just goes right in place. And make sure that your keys line up with your brace, with the slot in the brace, to make sure that that's seated correctly so that we don't do damage to the brace. And this is our completed first design output input shaft assembly, and this assembly is ready to drop into our Richmond 6-speed overdrive. As I gather more information on these 6-speeds, I'm going to pass it along to you as I gather the information. And I wanted to show you the difference in tail housings on these applications, because right now I've got 2 GM transmissions here on the bench. The complete one on my right with the tail housing on it is a GM application. It's 22.5 inches in length, and the tail housing is about 7 inches long on it, and it is a pure GM application. And the other tail housing that I've got here on a trans that I'm working on is 9.5 inches in length, and it is also a GM application, but it goes into a F-body GM car, and they were done primarily by Richmond Gear up in Liberty, South Carolina to replace a T5. And you'll notice lining up with the two transmissions, you'll notice that the shifter plate on the front application, that is the GM application, the plate for the shifter is straight up, where the plate here on the rear tail housing is at a 17-degree angle. That was done so that the shifter stick would come up through the original location of a T5 application in an F-body GM car. And the length, you'll notice the tail housing here on the back of it, the extra material was for both a Ford application and a GM application for the F-body. But in the Ford application, the shifter plate would stand straight up. In the GM application, it had a tilt of 17 degrees, so that it would come through the hole in the floor where a T5 was. Everything else about this transmission is the same, other than the length of the output shaft, which was different for the GM and different for the Ford, and different for the GM application with the 17-degree tilt. Like I said, as I learned more about this stuff, this application I didn't know existed, and I wanted to show you the differences. So if you've got one, or if you're looking for one, you see one you might want to buy, you got an idea of what you're looking for and how many different applications they did for these. And I know one thing for a fact is, for this longer length application, that there are no longer any parts being made for the output shaft, tail housing, shifter application, so forth. So that part of this transmission is extremely hard to find any pieces for, where the front part of the transmission is identical, whether you've got the long output or the short output, the Ford or the GM. And you can still find components for the GM length, some components, but for the Ford length, the output shaft, tail housing, now it'll almost be impossible to find parts for. But as I learn more about these applications and I find out different things, I'll pass that along to you, and thought it would be something that you would be interested to know, and to know that there is a difference, and that the shifter sits at an angle on the side of the transmission was very interesting to me, and thought I'd pass it along to you. Thank you for watching the video.